This is the Mike Rosen Show.
Adjectives on the typewriter. He moves his words like a prize fighter. Save somebody.
Mike Rosen.
We got to see it all.
On KOA News Radio, 850 AM, and now on 94.1 FM.
Good afternoon and welcome to the program. 713-8585, our telephone number. We're going to start off with a guest we've had on the program several times over the years. His name is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, and he's a medical doctor, not an academic doctor. Author of a book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, subtitle, An American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. Dr. Jasser is a first-generation American Muslim whose parents fled the oppressive Ba'ath regime of Syria in the mid-1960s for American freedom. He also served 11 years as a medical officer in the U.S. Navy. He was chief resident at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He's now in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona. And he's founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Zuhdi, good to have you with us again.
Oh, it's great to be with you again. Thanks for bringing me back.
I'll ask you a little later on to tell us about the work that your organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, is doing. But the reason I have you on today, I want you to respond to a claim that I've received from many, many people. And I want to read part of an email I got from a listener who says the following. It's my understanding, she says, that when there's a conflict between later and earlier passages in the Quran, the later passages are definitive and override the earlier passages. As you mentioned, talking about me, the nasty stuff is in the later passages. Also, the distinction between greater and lesser jihad is apparently not orthodox. The more moderate idea of jihad being an inner struggle, greater jihad, is an 11th century and not generally accepted interpretation. So she's saying that the correct interpretation of jihad, if you're going to rely on the later passages in the Quran, is the one that applies, and that's death to the infidels, and we see the product of that in Paris and in the United States, and even within the Middle Eastern provinces where not so radical Muslims are being killed by the ISIS crowd. She also says that with all aggressive regimes such as Hitler, Stalin, etc., the peaceful majority is irrelevant. The radicals set the agenda and subdue the peaceful majority. I use this one as an example of a lot of other emails I've gotten with the same theme. And their point is, if you as a Muslim don't accept the most radical interpretation of Islam, you're, in essence, an apostate. You've abandoned the faith. You're not really a Muslim. Based on that premise, the only legitimate interpretation of Islam is the ISIS version. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's a lot there to respond to, but let me start to dissect that a bit. The bottom line is there's no doubt that the Islamist program globally, the movements of political Islam, are commensurate with what is being described there, and that it's a fascist movement that is theocratic, that believes that only a few can determine the law, and it's what they believe to be God's law that they implement. Now, the question is that the only version of Islam? You know, whose Islam is the real Islam? You know, when you look at, let me start with the initial comments you made about jihad. You know, there's apologetics, obviously. The bottom line is most Muslim families name their kids with names from the Quran. So I have a lot of friends whose first name is Jihad, and I don't think that it makes sense that devout Muslims would call their kids holy war. Jihad, just like Zuhud means devoted to God. Jihad has a interpretation, a meaning throughout the Quran that has many things that it can mean. Just like Islam itself, the word actually is not peace. Salam means peace. Islam means submission. So that submission could be something peaceful and internal, or it could be something violent in which you commit an act of suicide bombing, and yet that's the name of the faith. So the bottom line is that the battle is over what dominates. Is it a secular interpretation, not anti-religious, but one that separates mosque and state? And that's why our declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement that we just put out and have started this bipartisan coalition in the West of Muslim groups that are dedicated to reform is so important, because, there's this other question about abrogation. Many of us reformers would tell you that God in the Quran, the Arabic of the Quran is written by God and transmitted to the Prophet. The interpretation of that is human. We even put in our principles that Sharia is human. It's man-made. It's not from God, which is blasphemy according to the Islamists. But yet, if Sharia was so important, it'd be all over the Quran. There's a lot of laws in the Quran, but the word Sharia you will have a hard time even finding other than maybe one or two instances of the root. So the bottom line is those laws, by being enacted by man, are man-made. Now, ultimately, the issue about interpretation is they're saying, well, the later passages are the ones about, allowing war, so therefore it canceled all the previous. You can't. Human beings cannot cancel previous passages. Where God does in the Quran, where he says he's canceled things, for example, alcohol, there are 3 different passages that relate to being allowed to drink. The first 2 allowed us to drink alcohol, and then the last one, God said, I've now canceled the previous ones because you guys can't go to your prayers 5 times a day without being inebriated, so I've now made the drinking of wine against our faith. So he clearly says there that he canceled the previous. So if God did not say that he canceled those, that's being done by theocrats, not to mention that the rationale behind having the permission to battle that happened later, when Muslims were attacked and when Muslims had agreement with the soul of Islam. I specifically talk about those passages in Chapter 5 and in Chapter 9 especially. And in Chapter 9, the simple line that says, kill the kuffar where you find them, or the infidels, is in reference to the Battle of Badr, which was one battle in 623 A.D. It does not have any sense of being applied to any other battle, even at the time, let alone 100 years or 1,400 years later. So the profiling of that passage by the Wahhabis to say that it applies to any non-Muslim, they even think it applies to me as a Muslim because I swear allegiance to a non-Muslim army. So, this is the issue, is that the need for Muslims to counter the Wahhabi narrative is done by saying that we separate history from religion. So there are passages that in the Quran that apply to all times, and there are others that don't. And Muslims have done this in many examples. One is polygamy.
Zuhdi Jasser, our guest, medical doctor, naval veteran, 11 years as a medical officer in the U.S. Navy, also chief resident at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, now in private practice in Arizona, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. So, given the fact that Jews disagree about the interpretation of the Talmud and the Torah, Christians disagree about the interpretation of the New Testament and will debate various passages and quotes in that seem to be in conflict. When Barack Obama broadly described Islam as a religion of peace, he was overgeneralizing, since obviously the Islamists who employ terrorist tactics do so in the name of Islam. ISIS, for example, Al-Qaeda for another. Clearly there are peaceful Muslims. You're one of them. And you also adhere to your religion as you perceive it. But there are factions within Islam, and it's debatable about just how large they are and how many people sympathize with their acts but don't perform those acts. That element of Islam is not a religion of peace. Can Muslims legitimately disagree about the interpretation, which, of course, is what some of the people who have been emailing me with the argument that I presented you with earlier, Zuhdi, they're saying no. The final chapters of the Quran trump everything, and that's the only interpretation of Muslim that anybody can take. Can you disagree?
Well, that's what I'm staking my life on. That's what we're staking our life's work, is that it's interesting. Islam is more akin to Judaism as far as not having clergy or hierarchy. Imam means teacher. It doesn't mean leader. So there is a inherent sense of decentralization in the faith. Now, clearly, there's a pseudo-clergy, clerical class that has arisen in its relationship with especially dictatorships and monarchies in the Middle East that has been two heads of the same snake, if you will, which is autocracy and theocracy that have merged. In Iran, they merge into one. In Saudi Arabia, they're almost one. And in governments like Egyptian dictatorship that controls Al-Azhar University that creates a lot of these imams around the world, there's been a very close kinship. So this is why you can't get rid of the ISISes of the world without getting rid of the Assads of the world, and that these regions may get sicker before they get better. But the bottom line is there's been a mutual oppression, if you will, of a mafia. I call it the Islamic mafia of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that has prevented Muslims from owning our own faith. And ultimately, this is why we got together last week at the National Press Club and formed the Muslim Reform Movement from left to right. 2 pages of principles that said we reject violent jihad, we reject the caliphate, we reject Islamic State, we accept the equality of men and women, and reject any gender apartheid. We lift up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this basically is sort of the goalpost of where we see reform headed. We say every Muslim has an equal right to their opinion regarding Islam, and that it's not owned by anybody. So this is sort of the beginning of how reform happens, is that we have an obligation living in countries as free as America to speak up regardless of how much they threaten us and put us on. I'll tell you, not only do groups like Islamist groups like CARE list me as an anti-Muslim bigot, et cetera, even though I love my faith and I'm pretty orthodox, the left, a group called Hope Not Hate, which should actually be called Hate Not Hope, a leftist group out of London, listed me as one of the enemies of Islam, which is just bizarre. So it's just interesting how partisan politics suppresses the voices of reform, so America sort of ends up thinking that we don't exist, when in fact there are many of us questioning, but we just don't have the platforms yet to get the word out.
You mentioned CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. That's a tool of the Muslim Brotherhood. They get funding from that element, and that's the element that they defend. So obviously you're the enemy as far as they're concerned.
Exactly, and they will do anything to hold on to their power structure that is a part of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation lobby, be it Saudi Arabia, be it their appearances on Press TV in Iran. And ultimately they see everything through the lens that everything is related to America and their anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that they foment. So ultimately these ideas can be reformed. Americans just need to start taking sides within the House of Islam. The polarity that we see in America between one side, that the Hillary side, if you will, that says Islam theocrats, and then the other side that has a voice within the right now that's saying that all Muslims are the problem and basically alienates the sense of reform. And I think we need this tough love where we say, Muslims in America can lead this, but they need to own up to it and take responsibility for the ideas that are creating radicalization. And I'd ask people to find us at MuslimReformMovement.org and sign our petition and help make this into a strategy for media, government, Homeland Security, academia, faith-based institutions to look at the Muslim Reform Movement platform. And if mosques accept it, we've taken it to mosques, posted it on their doors, and asked them to respond to it. If they accept that declaration, then they're part of the solution. If they don't, they're part of the radicalization.
Is everything Muhammad ever said, is that taken as infallibility?
No, he's a man, and number one. Number two, most of the hadith that say that he said these things, for example, the Hamas charter says Muhammad said, kill a Jew behind every stone. We signed documents saying that we reject that. We don't believe the Prophet ever said that. So the bottom line is that most of what is purported to have said by the Prophet is actually just fabricated years, decades, some of it 300 years after his death, through an oral tradition was written down supposedly as though there was a hadith my grandfather, a Sharia expert, used to show me. He said, look, it says in this book from Ibn Taymiyyah, and is half the size of a man. And he said, he had 6 daughters, one of them was my mom, and he said, this is absurd. The Prophet would have never said that. And then he showed the proof that this is not a legitimate hadith. It was created by some tribe that used it to oppress women. So the issue is most of the radicalism in Islam comes from actually corrupted sayings of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, Zuhdi, thanks for being with us. Give that website again.
MuslimReformMovement.org.